So I decided that I would try to avoid the issue of technical problems, which invariably are going to crop up anyway, and have a one-slide issue. Essentially, I've got three major points to my talk. I'm here to talk about villains. I love villains. I like that there was a yay there. Amazing. And I think probably... Now, this is going to split the room. I'm probably going to split the room 2 or 3 times tonight. I prefer DC to Marvel. And I've realised, though, that my favourite superheroes tend to be Marvel superheroes. And I think the reason I prefer DC is because I prefer their villains. My favourite Shakespeare play is the first mentioned. It is Othello, solely because Iago is just such an absolute arsehole. He's brilliant. Such a really fascinating character in the sense of how he deals with things. And so I thought I'd come along and tell you how to make yours better. Which I'm aware that not every single person in this room makes games, but regardless, hopefully thinking about it from this perspective should make things quite interesting. So first up, in a joke I've stolen from the internet, who is this clown? Which is actually the most insulting thing that you can say to people, because one, it suggests that people are a clown, and secondly, not even one of the better known clowns. To be fair, the only clown I know is Pagliacci, but beyond that, it's a tricky thing. I am not a clown. I know some clowns. I am a magician. So, related spheres. And essentially what that means, though, is that means I spend a lot of my thoughts in that, thinking about how I'm trying to manipulate my audience, which sounds terrible. But specifically how I'm trying to make them think in a specific way, how I'm trying to guide their thoughts, how I'm trying to make stuff, one, entertaining for them, and secondly, trying to make it so that they respond in the way that I need them to respond. I'm not just a magician. The day job is an English teacher, largely, which is why we have the Shakespeare reference at the top. And that means that I then focus a lot on narrative. It means I focus on the way in which the stories are told, the way in which the stories interact, the way in which that is then compelling to someone who is reading. I always confuse my students because although I got better scores in my maths exams, I much preferred English because I can't imagine trying to get anybody to love maths, although I loved maths, but I can imagine trying to get people to love literature. And so that's kind of the draw for that. And I'm also kind of a games designer of sorts, but more of like the tabletop, so quite a bit of like tabletop roleplay, increasingly so card games, and if you have a lot of hearts, you can approach Mr. Tucker later and receive a collection of 3 card games called Cons Prial. Which I put out last year. So that kind of means that I'm trying to think about not only an interesting villain from a narrative perspective, but how I can make it interesting specifically to interact with. And there's 2 major threads to this, happily colour-coded. The first of them are the way in which you should think about villains mechanically. And then the second part being how you should think about villains narratively. Now, the first, I've also got a nice little selection of ASCII art there. Can anybody tell what the very first one is, alongside the agency part there, what that might represent? There's a little bit more of a murmur there. Actually, you guys brought this up earlier. I was thinking what's most fascinating about a villain, and what makes a villain narratively interesting, is the fact that they are agents themselves. So a villain should have agency. A villain should have the ability to do something. Because if a villain can't do anything, then they're essentially powerless, and then there's no reason to want to do anything about them. Now, a lot of games do this really badly, and again, this is going to be another part where I'm going to split the room. I think Bowser is a bad villain. I think he's an interesting character, but I don't think he's a good villain, because he doesn't really do much until eventually you hit him. Now, this is kind of a continuum of sorts. In order for a villain to have agency, the character needs to lose that agency. And I thought the best example for that would probably actually be Pac-Man. Because your goal is just to collect all the little pills, all the way around the little maze. Now, technically our villains, in this case, we've got Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde, which actually I only learnt this evening, have distinct personalities, which I think is fascinating. Each of they will move around and will stop you from going in certain places that you want. So by moving themselves, that prevents you as a player from moving. So that makes them interesting from that perspective because their actions prevent you doing things. Now that means you could kind of play a really risky game. I massively remember games from my youth where there was just that single last part that I'd have to time it perfectly, just zip in, grab the last one to be able to actually clear it out. But without them doing things, it makes your own actions in that sense a little bit pointless. And the best way to make people really care about this is slightly similar to the Halloween talk that Christos gave about jump scares, which is that you set up something and then you break those rules. So the best way mechanically to get your players to care about a villain is to take away their toys. If you've gone all the way through enjoying something, really enjoying use of something, or at least not necessarily enjoying it from an emotional perspective, but being able to use it, and then suddenly it goes, then that's horrible. I can't necessarily think of a really good example for this, because as one, you can tell by my ASCII art, and secondly by the game references I'm going to make as we continue through this, I'm not excessively up to date on a lot of modern games. So my most up-to-date example of a game I've played from this is the Ocarina of Time, where in the very final fight, you lose the Master Sword. So you go up, you need it in order to finally defeat the villain, and he knocks it out of the arena that you cannot access it until you've basically run through a number of loops. And that's the sort of thing you want to be able to do. Not only do your villains prevent your players doing something, they also have the power to take things away, potentially permanently, in the case of character death in long-running RPG games, something that's completely going to go. And that is through their agency, and that's something that you should look to be able to enact wherever you can. The second thing, and now this is an incredibly abstract piece of art there, but can anybody guess who that might be? No. Although I can see why. No. It wouldn't be him. Exactly, I'm talking about villains. Oh, yes. So Robotnik, known for his round face and wide moustache. And he kind of brings up a question. Now, I read... Basically, I play Magic the Gathering. I have an entire chest of drawers completely full of the cards, which at no point do I ever want to calculate how much I've spent on them. In much the same way you never want to work out how much rent you've spent, that same sort of thing. But this worries me more. But alongside that, I read quite a lot of articles with its head designer. And one of the ones that stuck out most to me is when Mark Rosewater was talking about when you're having villains, do you focus on your brain or do you focus on brawn? Is it intelligence or strength? What is it that happens? And essentially, what makes it most interesting a lot of the time is to have two. So your primary villain is going to be excessively brainy. And then you may have one who's a lot more brawny to support that. I mean, if you're doing this from, and actually quite a lot of encounter design articles that I've been reading recently in the sense of pure tabletop, where if you're running a session, you've got this massive bad guy, incredibly powerful wizard. He's going to die in the first round because he's just not got enough life. But you put a massive bodyguard there, and then that's going to split. Do we go for the guy who's protecting him, or do we go for the guy who's got the massive nuke powers? What are we going to focus on? And essentially having these two in balance makes things really interesting. You cannot hyper-specialize in one thing, because then you're going to realize you're definitely going to come against something else. But also I think it's quite interesting I really like looking for binaries like this. If I'm trying to work out, do I really want to push in one direction, or do I really want to push in another direction? And so seeing a point where you can work out, are they predominantly driven by the need to do this intelligently, or through the need to do this through strength? And then having some of the other characters around them supporting that, and also having your sub-villains in that same sense, also having agency, and also having agency in relation to their boss. Even if they don't directly agree with what's going on, how are they still acting themselves? And that's, again, something I find really interesting that can be operating completely beyond exactly how the villain itself is doing, which is fairly complex thing, and it's also such a nuanced thing, you may never spot it in a story, you may never spot it in a game. So kind of building up the whole idea, if you're spending development time on this, why do you want to do it? And I think in the bottom line, it will make the game seem that much more real. It will build through things, and it will make your characters feel like they're interacting in a real world, even if at no point do they ever see it. I used to act. I haven't auditioned for too long a time, actually. And at one point, I played Jack the Ripper in a promenade play. And my director had a point where he said, after you've had this scene, and this was the scene where one of the ladies of the night who was guiding the tours around, at one point you then see her on the other side of a river, and then she has a conversation with the man who's been doing all the murders, and then she's killed in front of them. Now, immediately after that scene, people were then walking off, and I had to run all the way up a hill, up down some stairs, just to stand at a point and watch the group going past. Now, there was a very considerable... In fact, it was most likely that no one would necessarily look up there. One person might, in the 3 nights that it ran, and for that person it was worth it enough doing that. But John had the opinion that it didn't matter if nobody ever looked, because in kind of having that intent there at any point, that's going to create the same emotion, the same feel, and it's that kind of realism that you want to create, even if at no point are your players ever going to be consciously aware of, oh, this was done for us. It's just going to be, I can't put my finger on that. It's amazing for some reason. And it's by making it compelling at that then it kind of like drives people talking about your game, which invariably, everything comes down to money, will get more people buying your game, which is definitely something you should do. So that's how to think about them. Or at least, I think they're the 2 most important things about when you're thinking about how you're going to portray your villain. But then, you also have like the narrative side and the way in which they kind of want to act. And essentially this kind of boils down into 2 things. What's the difference between a hero and a villain? Morals? Perspective? Yeah, I mean, for a lot of the time from, like really, the bottom line of it comes down to where we see, like the perspective that we're shown. That kind of helps with things. Like a moral system that we've got going there as well can kind of support this too. But a lot of the time, very few people will run around, apart from maybe some Shakespearean villains, kind of the flip side of this, but will run around saying, I am evil, this is what I'm doing. Most of the time you're going to have, here is a positive goal I want to achieve, and it's then entirely based on your sway of morality as to whether or not this is a good action or a bad action. And actually, talking about, I like the brain and the brawn duality there. I don't necessarily like good or evil as pulling points when we're thinking narratively in this sense, because I think it simplifies things too much, where it's much more interesting to think about what people individually wanting to get towards and what we're focusing on for that. So, what a villain is aiming for needs necessarily to be sufficiently villainous, because otherwise you're just fighting a bureaucrat, essentially, for the sense of that. Which again seems to be a recurring villain in my stories and in my games, which is probably quite telling. So my really bad ASCII there again is an explosion. Specifically, that is the world exploding. It's tired, it's cliched, but essentially the big problem if I want to destroy the world or I want to remove everything else is one of there is no coming back from this. It's an act that can never be redeemed. It's something that is ultimately a massive act of power, and once this is done, things are gone, completely finished. I have done this, it's removed all other options here. That is inherently villainous, because, and I suppose in the sense of agency again, this prevents other people being able to do things. This isn't just because, oh, we're annihilating, it's not a case of like, there are all of these ants here that are destroying our crops and we're going to die from that, and therefore we need to get rid of these ants. This is a case of, I am removing the choices of anything affected by this. So you need to have a motivation for your characters. And again, if you're playing 2 villains, you don't necessarily want them to have the same. They might align, that might be why they're together. They might have slight differences in here. You can then also link those directly in with your characters if at certain points it's a case of, and I've not played it, but one of the things I really like about reading about Shadow of Mordor is where you've got the villains will then become aware of your actions based on situations that have gone on, and then that kind of will shift a motivation to make it seem again more realistic and more immersive for you. And then the other thing that makes someone truly villainous, and probably my most obscure ASCII, is the execution. And it's not only obscure because of the sense of what it is, but also in the why it's relevant in this sense. Are there any guesses? The very first thing was a whale. It is a whale. Actually, it's an arc whale. Does anybody get that reference? An arc whale. That man is correct. Yes, so arc whale specifically, this is Racnam/Plurgoth, the purple gigas, from Skies of Arcadia. Frankly, one of the games that has massively influenced my brain more than potentially anything else. Skies of Arcadia is a beautiful game, absolutely phenomenal, and I'm not going to say anything more than that, apart from the incredibly relevant section, otherwise I will not stop talking. But the major villains in the game don't just set about trying to establish dominance, they do that by awakening ancient powers on the Earth to annihilate anything that could possibly stand in their way. So it's such a case of we're not just going to continually oppress everyone, we're not just going to build stronger and stronger firepower, we're not going to input that. We are going to create things on such an incredible, unassailable scale that you can never deal with this. And it's by doing it in such a strong and such, again, and I really like the fact that you said when you were building up what made really interesting villain is you'd need an agenda even, and of course agency comes from the same root. That's what you really need. They are doing it in such a way that their villainy comes down to the fact that I am stopping you and I'm stopping everyone else from doing this, and this is why you need to do it. A man once said, I forget which man it was, all it takes for evil to succeed is for the good man to do nothing. And that's what your game needs to feel like. Otherwise, you're just running along, dodging enemies, until eventually you run across a guy at the end who happens to have a princess there. But he's not really done that much to stop you, even if you can't tell potentially that he's put some people in your way. And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to be sure of. I want to care about your villains. Your villains need to care themselves, and they need to be able to show their care through their actions. And that's me.